In the last session, we found out how the growth of the United States, physical, geographical growth, was really driving home these divisive issues in American political life. And of course, what is going to become of this territory, whether that's conquered territory from Mexico or claimed territory in a place like Oregon country. What's going to happen to that once it comes into the Union as a state? Is it going to be free? Is it going to be slave? We're going to see another continuation of that here in a few minutes. As we add more and more territories to the United States, there's going to be constitutional crises, I guess you could call them, with respect to what is to be made of these states. You have to keep in mind, by 1850, both sides were deeply, deeply dug in when it comes to not really wanting to see another state, free versus slave, come into the country and tip the balance of power in the opposition's favor. What I'll say about the Compromise of 1850 is this. It didn't really matter if you were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. Most, if not all, people considered it to be a dismal failure. Now that's important on a number of different levels. It's important, number one, because way back in 1820, with the Compromise with Missouri, this compromise, although it inevitably did nothing but prolong civil war, at the very least it lasted for 20 some odd years, or actually more than 20 years. The Compromise of 1850 is going to last for less than 4. Although the South walked away somewhat happy with the Fugitive Slave Act, they really did feel like they were sold short. And the Fugitive Slave Act was a crushing blow to the abolition movement. At least people like Frederick Douglass considered it to be so. So where I want to start is on the plains with the Kansas and Nebraska territories. One of the individuals that we didn't really mention as directly as I would have liked to with respect to the Compromise of 1850 would be a guy from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas. Now, Stephen Douglas was arguably the leading Democrat in the North, especially in the 1850s. And he was also a man that very much wanted to connect his largest city of his state, Chicago, with the western frontier, and that would be San Francisco. And to that end, what he wanted to do was produce a transcontinental railroad, with Chicago being its eastern origin. Now, in order to do this, you're going to have to bring both the Kansas and Nebraska territories into the Union as states. It just works out easier that way, considering that railroad's going to have to go right through the middle of that. It's also important for you to understand that there were southern cities, Memphis and New Orleans being a couple of them, that not only made a lot of sense from a logical standpoint when it comes to a starting point, but also very much wanted to be the eastern hub of the railroad network of the United States. There's a lot of money that's going to be coming through Chicago eventually. To really push the issue of Kansas and Nebraska's integration into the Union, we're going to have to come up with a new model when it comes to, are they going to be slave, are they going to be free? And to that end, the concept coined by Stephen Douglas is going to come to be known as popular sovereignty. In other words, first of all, let's put people on those states, and second of all, let's give those people the right to vote yea or nay when it comes to the legality of slavery. If they want it, they'll vote for it. If they don't, they'll make it illegal. It's pretty simple, and on paper it sounds really good. What's more democratic than elections in American democracy, okay? Well, the problem with the Kansas and Nebraska Act is, these elections don't play themselves out on paper, they play themselves out in reality. And in reality, it was kind of like Murphy's Law. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. Popular sovereignty allows Douglas to talk out of both sides of his mouth because he's able to appeal to the North at the same time that he's able to appeal to the South. To the North, he's saying, look, not only do you have more people, and there's a very good likelihood that you're going to win this election, but secondly, when you win the election, you can do things like make slavery so outrageously expensive that nobody would come to your neck of the woods. You can outlaw it. Anyway, the list goes on and on and on. But to the South, he's saying, look, this is a tailor-made opportunity to expand your representation in both the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. Get your people together, get them over there, and get them to vote. And so on the eve of the day that Kansas was going to be opened for settlement and consequently have a vote on slavery, there were a lot of pro-slavery settlers that gathered right on the Missouri-Kansas border. And when the settlement opened up, they poured across the border and they set up something called the Lecompton government, right? The Lecompton government quickly voted to establish Kansas as a slave state. The problem is, at least 60% of those votes that were cast were done so illegally. I mean, they were made up names, people voted twice, more than that, dead people were apparently voting, and so, you know, these were really, really corrupt sort of practices that were being used in Lecompton, Kansas. Complicating matters was the fact that a lot of free soil supporters had poured across the border and established a government of their own called the Lawrence government. Now, the Lawrence government quickly established a free soil platform, and basically what you've got in the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 is a situation where both governments are claiming legitimacy, okay? Now, the point of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was more or less to move this debate as to where slavery can go legally away from lawmakers and put it into the hands of the people. I mean, that was the essence of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to allow the people of the future states of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves what they wanted to do with respect to the issue of slavery. As you can clearly see, this isn't going so well, okay? Now, what happens in the aftermath of these two sides claiming victory is the sheriff of Lecompton sends a posse to Lawrence to round up the leaders of the Free Soil government, bring them back so that they can be tried for treason. I mean, is that dramatic? Well, that posse soon degenerated into a mob and more or less burned Lawrence to the ground. Maybe I'm being a little more dramatic here, but what you've got breaking out in Kansas in the aftermath of this catastrophe is what historians refer to as Bleeding Kansas. I always like to think of Bleeding Kansas as almost like a miniature civil war. Bushwhackers out there on the plains that are kind of approaching life as the Wild West, so to speak. Okay. Some of this violence is spilling over into the halls of Congress. The famous anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, a guy by the name of Charles Sumner, gave this really fiery anti-slavery abolitionist speech. And at the end of it, another senator from South Carolina, a guy by the name of Preston Brooks, approached him. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he basically said something like, you've insulted my state, you've insulted my family, and you've insulted my heritage. And at that point, he cracked him over the head with a cane. And so, you know, in the aftermath of this beating of Senator Sumner at the hands of Senator Brooks, it was said that the only people that were coming to Congress without a gun were coming to Congress with a gun and a knife. So these are very dangerous times. A dangerous individual was a guy by the name of John Brown. Now, John Brown was a radical abolitionist, and when I say radical, I mean crazy, okay? Brown had a checkered past, and we don't necessarily need to get into that, but he was absolutely appalled, outraged, and furious at what had happened with Lawrence, and he estimated that at least 5 people had been killed by pro-slavery forces. So, together with a posse of his own, he executed 5 pro-slavery supporters, and so, you know, this really adds fuel to the fire that is Bleeding Kansas. But back to the political issue of the time. The failures of the Kansas-Nebraska Act really do 2 things. One, the failure of the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed the Whig Party as a national political party in the United States. After 1854, it's basically going to go away and never to be heard from again. Now, a lot of the politicians that were very, you know, involved in the Whig Party, a lot of them are going to gravitate to this newly emerging political caucus known as the Republican Party. So I am talking about the Ronald Reagan, George Bush, George W. Bush, modern-day Republican Party. So this Republican Party, its whole reason for being is the limitation of where slavery can go. Now, whereas the Democratic political platform, way back when Andrew Jackson established it in the 1820s, was a limited federal government, an emphasis on individual rights, and an emphasis on states' rights. The political platform of the Republican Party is no slavery in the Western territories. In other words, Kansas and Nebraska, slavery will not go out there. If you elect our guys, that's what our guys are going to give you, is a limitation on where slavery can go. So what I need you to understand about the Republican Party is it becomes the vehicle of the anti-slavery movement. Of course, you've got people like Frederick Douglass that are going to become very adamant supporters of the Republican Party, but just like we were talking about with the Free Soil movement, it's perfectly possible for an individual to be anti-slavery and anti-African American all in the same person, and you do have a lot of people that were of that variety. One of those individuals, a former Whig in his own right from Illinois, was a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call Lincoln anti-African American, but he certainly was no supporter of social and even maybe political equality for blacks, at least not in 1854 anyway. Okay? But all of this is leading us into the election of 1856, the presidential election. And so the Democrats, once again, nominate a Northerner, a guy by the name of James Buchanan. And again, he's useful because it's much more difficult for anti-slavery forces to kind of label him a slave power conspirator. The Whigs are really not going to be much of a factor in this election, and even if they were, they're going to have to split their votes with the newly established Republican Party. Now, the Republicans ultimately lose this election, but if you are a Republican, if you're somebody like Lincoln, you really got to feel pretty good about yourself, considering they made a very good showing, especially if you consider this is a brand new political organization, which in American history really don't tend to do very well, at least not in the early stages anyway. Buchanan, for his part, is arguably, on any given occasion, one of the top 3 worst American presidents in U.S. history, okay? Now, you're going to find out why that is, but first and foremost, Buchanan had ties to pro-slavery forces, even though he wasn't necessarily in bed, so to speak, with slavery as an institution. He really didn't do a whole lot to settle this issue of where slavery can go and what it can do. Furthermore, he doesn't do virtually anything to really kind of encourage compromise and preservation of the Union. And that's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what makes him such a bad president, okay? Now, simultaneously, we've got developments in the Supreme Court of the United States that are going to complicate the matters of both this issue of slavery as well as the presidency of James Buchanan. A Missouri-born slave by the name of Dred Scott had been taken to Illinois around about this time by his owner, and as you should know, ever since there was a state of Illinois, Illinois had been a free state. Illinois was, like Michigan and Ohio, part of that old Northwest Territory, and as you should recall, the Northwest Ordinance forbade slavery from moving into that part of the country. Now, Scott is beginning to think to himself, look, I'm no legal scholar here, but at the same time, I'm living in Illinois. Should I not be a free man? And so what Scott does is he sues his owner for his freedom, and he wins. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court of Illinois, the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court verifies the lower court's decision that Scott is, in fact, free. Now, Scott's owner doesn't take this lying down. He appeals it one more time, this time to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the Supreme Court is headed up, the Chief Justice is a guy by the name of Roger B. Taney, who is from Maryland, the South, and he's also a slave owner in his own right. What the Supreme Court does in 1857 is going to shock the Republicans, it's going to shock the abolitionist movement, and to some extent, it's going to shock everybody across the North. What it says is really 2 things. The first is far less important than the second. First thing it says is, Dred Scott, I hate to burst your bubble about this, but you are a slave. And legally that defines you as property. A hammer, a horse, an anvil wouldn't have access to a courtroom, let alone be able to sue its owner in court. And so therefore you have no access to the courts, and therefore the Illinois state courts decisions are irrelevant. They're moot at this point. They have no authority. You never should have had your day in court in the first place. You're not a citizen, and you need to be a citizen to sue somebody. So I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but no, you are not free. You're actually a slave. All right, now that's one thing. First of all, that's a really terrible decision to begin with. But the second part of that decision is infinitely more complicated, confusing, and problematic. The second part of the decision emphasizes, and I want you to write this down, the Dred Scott decision emphasizes that Congress has no authority to regulate the institution of slavery. Congress doesn't have the ability to say slavery is legal here but illegal there. The only people that have the right to do that, according to the Supreme Court, are the people of whatever state you're talking about. Now, a couple things about that. One, what that basically means is slavery can go anywhere it wants to go. It can go to Kansas, it can go to Nebraska, it can go to any of the conquered territories in Mexico, it can go to Oregon country, it can go anywhere it wants to go. But furthermore, the court clarified its decision by saying, look, slaves being property can also be taken anywhere, including to free states. So theoretically, what Dred Scott's owner did was perfectly legal in the sense that he took him from Missouri, a slave state, into Illinois, a free state, and it was no different than taking his horse or his wagon or his plow or any other property that belonged to his owner. Now, back to this whole issue of the only legal entity that has the right to regulate slavery is the people of whatever state. You have to understand that that's going against over 60 years of U.S. legal history. I mean, think all the way back to the Northwest Ordinance. This is in the 1780s. It was Congress that issued that law that said no slavery in the Northwest Territory. What the Supreme Court says is Congress never had a right to do that. Theoretically, Ohio could have been a slave state if it wanted to be. It's saying that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was illegal, that, Congress saying that slavery was okay in Missouri, but not okay in Maine, that was illegal, and anything south of Missouri was open to slavery, that was illegal. Congress doesn't have any ability to do that. Compromise of 1850, also illegal, because Congress doesn't have the ability to do that, or at least not constitutionally anyway. Okay? So this is a huge, huge blow to the abolition movement. It's an even bigger blow to the Republican Party. You have to keep in mind that the Republican Party's whole reason for being was to outlaw slavery west of the Mississippi River. Well, if that's your platform, what the Dred Scott decision has done is essentially made you an illegal political organization. Your platform is illegal in the eyes of the highest court in the land. You can see how and why this Dred Scott decision is such an important watershed moment in American history, because there's no way that really the people of the North generally, but specifically the Republican Party, which is more or less a regional party, doesn't exist in the South for obvious reasons. But anyway, you can see how and why they could never accept the legitimacy of that ruling. There was going to have to be something that was going to come out from of Congress to kind of overturn that ruling, or at least soften it. Okay. Now, a couple years later, we're running into another presidential election. And this is an election that the Republicans feel quite strongly about. Feel that, if they can find the right guy, they can really make some noise in national politics, maybe even take the presidency. Now, as you might imagine, Abraham Lincoln is a very important figure within this whole movement of the Republican Party. He was, let's call him, a known commodity when it comes to a Republican, but he certainly wasn't anywhere near the heavyweight that was Stephen Douglas. Now, in 1858, Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas for that seat in the Senate in Illinois. And one of the things that you do when you're clearly not as big and as well known as somebody else as you debate them. And that's exactly what Lincoln does with Stephen Douglas, and it comes to be known very famously as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Lincoln would continuously challenge Stephen Douglas, who was sort of like the leading Democrat, at least in the North, on this whole issue of the legality of slavery. And he really kind of set a trap for him in the sense that he asked them, in light of this recent Supreme Court case ruling, doesn't that open up anywhere and everywhere to slavery? And what Douglas said was, no, it doesn't, because what the people of Kansas or Nebraska, for instance, could do is make slavery so undesirable. They could tax it outrageously. They could really restrict the rights and, privileges of where slaves could go and what they could do, that nobody in their right mind would ever want to move to those two states, or any other state that did that for that matter. Okay? Well, what this does is basically forces Stephen Douglas to commit political suicide on a national level. Right? I mean, he's unelectable in the South. There's no way this guy is even going to get on the ballot in a place like Alabama. So, at any rate, it's also bringing a lot of notoriety to Abraham Lincoln. As people are buzzing, talking about this prairie lawyer that's debating maybe the most powerful Democrat in the country at the time, and he's holding his own with him. Now, Lincoln went on to lose that election. Stephen Douglas defeated him in the senatorial election, but it really put him on the map politically on a national scale. So in the election of 1860, the leading Republican is actually not Lincoln. It's a guy from New York by the name of William Sewall. And when it comes to the issues of slavery, Sewall is much more of the radical Republican variety than he is the moderate Republican. I mean, Abraham Lincoln's very much a moderate in the sense that he's anti-slavery, but he's certainly not one of these individuals like Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner that wants to not only eradicate slavery, but also elevate African Americans to social, political, and cultural equality with whites. As a matter of fact, that was one of the things that Lincoln was very adamant to point out in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the 1850s, that he was not in favor of that. Well, as the election approached, and as I say, when it approached, as we're talking about the actual Republican National Convention held in Chicago, this dark horse of Abraham Lincoln begins to gain more and more steam. And in particular, what a lot of people of the Republican variety realize is that Lincoln is way more electable than somebody like Sewall. And first of all, Lincoln's from a Midwestern state, a state that's bordering places like not only Indiana and Wisconsin, it's also bordering southern states like Kentucky. And this is going to be important considering he's going to look a lot less, like a blue chip kind of political candidate, a blue blood, if you will, California, Massachusetts. In our day and age, it would be maybe somebody like from Texas or New York, somebody that's really a Washington insider. And furthermore, Lincoln being a moderate, especially when it comes to social equality, really played well to Midwestern and Northern voters who really weren't quite sure how they felt on this whole issue of emancipation just quite yet. My point being, Lincoln is far more electable than anybody else within the Republican Party. And so, that being the case, it's on the eve of the convention that the Republican Party decides to nominate Abraham Lincoln on the premise that they now understand if they can carry every northern state, if they get every state in the North, then they'll win the election, even if Abraham Lincoln's name doesn't even appear on the ballots in the South. In other words, you can win the presidency without one Southern vote, as long as you can carry every northern state. And so what we do here is we put Abraham Lincoln on the ballot in 1860 because he's way more electable than somebody from New York like Sewall. Okay? Now, Abraham Lincoln is going to go on to win that presidential election, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time about talking about it. I mean, it's interesting on a number of different levels, but all I really need you to understand is Lincoln does manage to carry every state in the North, with the exception of one, but he made up for that state by carrying both California and Oregon in 1860. So Lincoln's the winner, and he demonstrates to the South that you're no longer relevant from a presidential perspective. I mean, we can win being the North, and we don't even have to campaign in your neck of the woods. And so there are people in the South, people like Alexander Stevens, that are really very much tossing around the S word, secession, right? Um, South Carolina actually made the claim that if Lincoln was in fact elected, that they would secede from the country. Okay. Now, in the aftermath of Lincoln's election, there's dramatic events that are going to happen in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Our good friend John Brown comes back to burst on the scene, and what he does is he raids a federal arsenal where guns and weapons are manufactured in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. You have to understand the magnitude of this. This is a person that a lot of people, like in today's society, would call a terrorist, right? Certainly the South thought of him like a terrorist. And so it would be the equivalent of a terrorist organization taking over a nuclear power plant or having access to a nuclear weapon. It was really, really concerning news. Now, ultimately, John Brown's raid was designed to lead a massive slave rebellion across the South by handing out weapons to anybody and everybody, slaves or free, that chose to join in on the fight. And ultimately, the U.S. government is able to put this down through the leadership of Robert E. Lee, who's a colonel in the Army at the time, and that name will become much more familiar to you in the coming days when you start to talk about the Civil War. But for the time being, I need you to understand that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, even though it was unsuccessful, sent shockwaves through the South. I mean, keep in mind, in places like South Carolina, they lived in fear day and night of a slave uprising. And now here's a guy from the North that's actually helping the slaves to do that, or at least tried to anyway. The significance of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry really is twofold. One, it doesn't get universal condemnation. Nobody goes ahead and calls John Brown out in the North. I mean, we arrest him, don't get me wrong, and eventually he's executed for treason. He took up arms against the U.S. government. But at the same time, there's not universal condemnation. And in a lot of circles, John Brown's a hero. He's a martyr for the cause that is anti-slavery. And so what that demonstrates to the South is not only are you irrelevant politically, Abraham Lincoln made note of that, but now you've actually got a man from the North that is trying to, destroy your way of life as you know it. And so what a lot of people in the South, especially the Deep South, began to believe is, even though Lincoln might present himself as a moderate, even though he doesn't really look and act and talk a whole lot like a John Brown, believe me, all Northerners are capable of this. That's the Southern way of thinking at the time. That even though Abraham Lincoln doesn't look and talk a lot like John Brown, he's capable of doing what John Brown did. And so that convinced states like South Carolina that they had no other recourse other than to secede. And in the aftermath of all of this, that's exactly what you're going to see South Carolina do, is issue ordinances of secession saying that it's leaving the Union. Okay? Now, we'll pick it up with this political crisis of secession the next time we meet.